A poor rancher saved to obese sisters only. To face their father's shocking decision the very next day, the wind howls across a frozen valley. A rancher, down to his last dollar, opens his door to two abandoned daughters left shivering in the snow. He offers them shelter. But in a town where whispers cut sharper than knives, kindness can cost a man everything. Just as hope flickers, heavy hooves pound the dirt road. Their father returns not with mercy, but with papers that could bind the rancher's life, land, and reputation forever. Behind those papers lies a secret deal, forged in greed and betrayal. Now the fire that warms a home may be the spark that burns it to the ground. Will this poor rancher find the strength to fight for dignity and family? Will lose everything to a father who sees his daughters as nothing more than bargaining chips? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind howled outside James Boone's ranch house, rattling the loose window pane in its wooden frame. Inside, the three figures sat in uncomfortable silence around his scarred kitchen table, the yellow lamplight casting long shadows on the wall. James watched as Maybelle, the older sister, wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee he'd offered, seeking its warmth. Her younger sister Nora sat straight-backed, her eyes darting between James and the door as if planning an escape route. "Much obliged for the beans," Maybelle said softly, breaking the quiet. "Been a spell since we had a proper meal." James merely nodded, unused to company in his solitary home. The events in town still played through his mind, the cruel laughter of the men outside the mercantile, Silas Dyer's drunken voice declaring he'd sell his own daughters to cover his gambling debts, the sisters' faces burning with shame. "You didn't have to step in back there," Nora said suddenly, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "We could have managed." James shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "Reckon nobody should treat their kin that way," he said quietly. "Ain't right." Maybelle dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve. "Papa wasn't always like this." The drink changed him. "After Mama passed," she stopped, her voice catching. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney. James rose to add another log, grateful for the moment's distraction. His own ghosts whispered in the corners of this empty house, his brother's absence still an ache that never quite healed. "Where will you have us sleep?" Nora asked, practical despite her obvious exhaustion. James gestured to the narrow hallway. "Got 2 rooms back there. Mine's the first. You can take the other. Used to be my brother's." He hadn't opened that door in months, but necessity demanded it now. "We don't mean to be a burden," Mabel said, her gentle voice trembling. "Just until we can figure something else out." James returned to his seat, studying the worn grain of the table. "Stay as long as you need. Ranch works hard enough with 2 hands. And winter's coming on fierce." He wasn't sure why he'd made the offer, perhaps because their desperate situation stirred memories of his own dark days after losing his brother. Nora's eyes narrowed. "And what do you expect in return, Mr. Boone?" "Nora." Maybelle gasped, but James understood the younger sister's suspicion. "Expect you to pull your weight is all?" "Cooking, maybe. Mending?" He met Nora's challenging gaze. "Nothing improper. You have my word." Some of the tension left Nora's shoulders, though wariness still lined her face. "I can cook," she said. "And we both know our way around a needle and thread." "I make a fair hand at baking too," Maybelle added softly. "When we can get flour and such." James thought of the sack of flour he'd purchased in town, now sitting in his wagon. He'd spent more than he should have, but maybe it would prove worth it. "Got flour enough. Butter too, from my cow." The sisters exchanged a look, years of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Maybelle spoke again. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Boone? Most folks in town just look away when Papa ... double quotes." She trailed off, unable to finish. James stood, his chair scraping against the rough floorboards. "Because looking away ain't right," he said simply. "I'll fetch your bags from the wagon. Then I'll show you to your room, outside." The bitter wind cut through his coat as he retrieved the sisters' meager belongings to worn carpet bags that held everything they owned in the world. The night sky stretched vast and dark above him, stars sharp as ice chips in the clear mountain air. For a moment, he leaned against the wagon wheel, questioning his own judgment. His ranch was barely surviving, the cattle too few, the work too much for one man. Taking in 2 women meant 2 more mouths to feed. More complications in his carefully ordered life. But when he thought of them standing in the street, facing their father's cruelty and the town's mockery, he knew he couldn't have done differently. Some burdens, he reckoned, were meant to be shared. Back inside, he found Maybelle had cleared the supper dishes while Nora swept the worn floorboards with his old broom. The simple domestic actions transformed the room somehow, making it feel less empty. "Come on," he said, lifting their bags. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." He led them down the narrow hallway, past his own door to his brother's room. The hinges protested as he pushed it open, dust motes dancing in the lamplight. The bed was still made up, though the quilt was faded. A dresser stood against one wall, a small mirror hanging above it. "It ain't much," he said, setting their bags down. "But it's warm enough once the fire gets going." Maybelle touched the quilt gently. "It's more than enough, Mr. Boone. Thank you." Nora moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer into the darkness. "Papa will come looking, you know." When he sobers up enough to remember, James met her worried gaze in the mirror's reflection. "Let him come," he said quietly. "This is my land, my house." "He's got no say here. He's mean when he drinks," Maybelle warned. "And he drinks most days now. I can handle Silas Dyer." James's voice held no threat, just quiet certainty. "You're safe here." "That's all that matters tonight." He left them then, closing the door softly behind him. In his own room, he sat on the edge of his bed, listening to their muffled voices and the soft sounds of them settling in. The house felt different already, as if it were waking up from a long sleep. Outside his window, the wind continued its lonely song across the Colorado highlands. But inside, something had changed. 3 solitary souls had found shelter together. And though none of them knew what tomorrow might bring, for now it was enough that they weren't facing the night alone. James lay down fully clothed, too tired to undress. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of his brother, and he wondered what Thomas would think of his decision to open their home to strangers. But then, Thomas had always been the one to remind him that sometimes the right path wasn't the easy one. In the next room, he could hear the sisters whispering, their voices a quiet comfort in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, work to be done, boundaries to be set, trust to be built. But tonight, they were safe from the wind and their father's rage. And sometimes, James knew that had to be enough. The lamp burned low, its flame flickering against the shadows. In the darkness of that winter night, 3 broken lives had intersected, brought together by chance and necessity. None of them could know then how this simple act of mercy would change all their lives. But as the house settled around them and sleep approached, there was a sense that something important had begun. The gray dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, painting the Boone Ranch in muted watercolors. James stood at his bedroom window, watching thin clouds scud across the winter sky. The sound of movement in the kitchen drew his attention, unfamiliar yet somehow welcome after so many months of silence. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, then made his way down the narrow hallway. The sight that greeted him stopped him short. Maybelle stood at his old cook stove. Her round face flushed from the heat as she worked flour into dough. The kitchen already smelled different, like yeast and promise. "Good morning, Boone," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "I hope you don't mind. I found some flour and thought to try my hand at biscuits. Mind? James shook his head. Been living on hardtack so long, I near forgot what a proper biscuit tastes like. A small smile touched Mabel's lips as she continued her work. Her movements sure, despite her obvious nervousness. Through the window, James could see Nora already up and moving around the barn, her dark skirt swaying as she examined something in her hands. I best check the fences, James said, reaching for his hat. Storm's coming, can feel it in my bones. He saddled his horse with practiced motions, the leather creaking familiar beneath his hands. The morning air bit sharp and clean, making his mare's breath steam in white puffs. As he mounted up, he noticed Nora had settled herself on an old crate by the barn door. Working with what looked like his spare set of reins, "These need mending something fierce," she called out, holding up the worn leather. "I can fix them proper, if you've no objection." James touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged," he said, and meant it. He clicked to his horse and rode out, the sound of Nora's humming following him across the yard. The fence line needed work. Winter was hard on wood and wire both. James dismounted several times to hammer loose posts back into frozen ground, his thoughts drifting to the strange turn his life had taken. Yesterday morning, he'd been alone. And now his quiet ranch held two women who seemed determined to make themselves useful. The sun had climbed past noon when he turned back toward home. The smell of fresh biscuits met him before he'd even dismounted, making his stomach growl. Inside, he found Mabel setting a plate of golden brown biscuits on the table, while Nora showed off the mended reins. "Look here," Nora said, holding up her handiwork. "Good as new, maybe better. Papa might have been worthless at most things, but he taught us leather work proper." A small laugh escaped Mabel at her sister's boldness, and soon Nora joined in. Their shared mirth, though tentative, filled the kitchen with warmth. James found himself smiling too, just a little. As he hung up his coat, the moment shattered at the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the road. James moved to the window, his jaw tightening as he recognized the rider. Silas Deere swayed in his saddle, his face already flushed with drink despite the early hour. The sisters fell silent, fear replacing their earlier joy. "Stay inside," James said quietly, stepping out onto the porch to meet their father. Silas dismounted clumsily, nearly falling. He steadied himself against his horse's flank, fixing James with a bleary glare. "Well, if it ain't the high and mighty James Boone," he slurred. "Taking in strays now, are you?" "Your daughters are safe here, Silas. Best you ride on home." Silas laughed, an ugly sound. "Home ain't got one no more. But I got something better." He fumbled in his coat, producing a crumpled paper. "Got this all signed and proper with the town clerk yesterday?" James took the document, dread settling in his gut as he read. The legal language was formal, but the meaning clear enough. Silas had signed over guardianship of both his daughters to James Boone. "What kind of game are you playing?" James demanded. "No game," Silas sneered. "Town was already talking about how you rode off with my girls. Now it's all legal and proper. They're your problem now, guardian, husband, whatever you want to call it." He spat in the dirt. "Unless you'd rather I sell those land rights to them railroad men who've been sniffing around?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. James knew the railroad had been buying up local properties, and his water rights were valuable. If Silas sold to them, James could lose everything his father and brother had worked to build. "You're drunk, Silas," James said evenly. "And you're a fool if you think. Silas barked another laugh. "I think you'll do right by them girls now, or everyone in town will know what kind of man you really are." "Your choice, Boone." With that, he swung back into his saddle, nearly missing it, and spurred his horse toward town. James stood holding the paper, his mind racing. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. What did he want? Nora's voice was tight with worry. James turned to find both sisters watching him, their faces pale. "Come inside," he said. "We need to talk." In the kitchen, he laid out the document on the table. Maybelle sank into a chair while Nora remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. James explained what their father had done, watching their expressions shift from shock to dismay. "He can't do this," Nora protested. "We're grown women, not cattle to be traded." "Law's not always just," James said quietly. "But I give you my word, nothing's going to change. You're safe here, same as before. I won't let him use you as pawns in his schemes." Maybelle's eyes filled with tears. "But your ranch, if he sells those rights, ... Land, just land," James said, though his heart clenched at the thought. "What matters is doing what's right." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, dancing past the window. Maybelle rose and moved to the stove, her hands shaking slightly as she stirred the pot of stew she'd prepared. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, a counterpoint to the tension in the air. "We should leave," Nora said suddenly. "Find work in Denver, maybe. We won't be the cause of you losing everything." James shook his head. "You'll do no such thing. Whatever your father's planning, we'll face it together. I made a promise to keep you safe, and I mean to keep it." The lamp cast warm light across the table as they sat down to supper. Maybelle bowed her head, her voice trembling as she offered grace. "Lord, give us strength for whatever comes. And thank you for bringing us to this place, to this good man who opened his home when others turned away." James watched the sisters across the table. Maybelle's gentle faith, Nora's fierce determination. Something protective stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his brother's death. Outside, the snow fell harder, and somewhere in town, Silas Dyer plotted his next move. But here in the warm kitchen, three people who'd been alone yesterday had found something like family. However strange and unexpected, the stew was hot and filling, the biscuits light as clouds. None of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. But when Maybelle rose to clear the dishes, Nora fell in to help, and James added wood to the fire. Their movements had the quiet harmony of people who'd chosen to stand together against the gathering storm. Word traveled like wildfire through Cedar Creek, spreading from porch to porch faster than the morning frost could melt. By Tuesday afternoon, every soul in town seemed to have an opinion about James Boone and the Dyer sisters. Inside Watkins Mercantile, Mrs. Peterson leaned over the counter, her voice hushed but carrying. "Did you hear? James Boone's got both them Dyer girls living out at his place. Just took them in, bold as brass." Behind the counter, Tom Watkins measured coffee beans with practiced motions, trying not to encourage the gossip. But Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished, and them being what they are, so large they can barely fit through a door. What's he thinking, taking on such a burden? The bell above the door chimed as more customers entered. Soon, the store hummed with whispered conversations, each one centered on James's decision. Over at the blacksmith shop, the talk grew even rougher. Wade Miller paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow as he addressed the men gathered to watch him shoe a horse. "Reckon Boone's gone soft in the head," he declared, hammering the hot metal with extra force. "Two big women like that'll eat him out of house and home by spring." The other men chuckled, though a few shifted uncomfortably, remembering how James had stood up to Silas Dyer's cruelty. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. James hitched up the wagon early, determined to attend church as usual. Maybelle and Nora emerged from the house wearing their best dresses, faded but clean, their hair neatly pinned up. "We don't have to go," Maybelle said softly as James helped them into the wagon. "We know how folks will talk. Let them talk," James replied, his voice firm. "You've as much right to worship as anyone. The small white church sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. As James drove up, he could see other wagons and riders arriving, people turning to stare as they recognized his passengers. Inside, the whispers started immediately. Widow Carson, her black bombazine dress rustling, leaned toward Mrs. Baker in the next pew. "Just look at the size of them," she hissed, not bothering to lower her voice much. "How long you reckon James Bunnell tolerates such useless mouths to feed?" James felt Maybelle stiffen beside him, saw Nora's hands clench in her lap. He guided them to a pew near the middle of the church, sitting down between them, a clear statement to anyone watching. Let them see he wasn't ashamed to be seen with the sisters. Preacher Thompson took his place behind the pulpit, his weathered face serious as he opened his Bible. His sermon that morning focused on God's family, how, through faith, all believers were adopted as children of the Lord. Think on how our Heavenly Father claims us. The preacher's voice rang out. Not for our worth in the world's eyes, but through His boundless love. We are all His children, regardless of how others might judge us. James found himself leaning forward, the words striking deep. He'd never thought much about adoption before, but now the concept resonated differently. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Once back at the ranch, Maybelle went straight to the kitchen, but her usual cheerful humming was absent. James found her later by the window, tears running down her face. "We'll ruin you," she whispered when she saw him. "The whole town's turning against you because of us." Before James could respond, Nora burst in from outside, her face flushed with anger and shame. "It's because we're fat." She spat the word like poison. "That's all anyone sees, not how I can work, or how May can cook better than any of those gossiping hens. They just see our size and judge us worthless." James let the silence settle for a moment before speaking. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're under my roof now," he said, looking at each sister in turn. "That means you're safe here. What others say doesn't change that one bit." Maybelle wiped her eyes with her apron, and even Nora's rigid shoulders softened slightly at his words. The evening drew in early, as winter evenings do. James lit the lamp while Maybelle and Nora cleared away the supper dishes. Without discussion, they gathered in the warm circle of lamplight, each with work in hand. Mabel settled into the old rocking chair with a basket of socks that needed darning. Her needle flashed steadily, closing holes with neat stitches. Nora spread a worn harness across her lap, her strong fingers working to repair the cracked leather dot. James sat at the table with his tools, fixing a broken gate latch he'd brought in from the barn. The quiet sounds of their work filled the room, the creak of the rocker, the soft scratch of Nora's all-through leather, the metallic clink of James's tools. None of them spoke much, but the silence was comfortable. Through simple tasks shared in the lamplight, something was taking shape, fragile as a spider's web, but growing stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't a conventional family, perhaps, but it was becoming something like one. Maybelle hummed softly as she worked an old hymn from that morning's service. After a while, Nora joined in, her deeper voice harmonizing with her sister's. James didn't sing, but he felt the music settle into his bones, as natural as breathing. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches and stars wheeled overhead. Inside, 3 people who'd been strangers a week ago worked side by side, their shadows dancing on the walls, their hearts slowly learning to trust in this unexpected gift of belonging. The old ranch house groaned under winter's icy grip. Frost crept across window panes in delicate patterns, while the wind whistled through every crack and crevice. James woke before dawn to find the kitchen pump frozen solid, ice crusting around its metal throat. He stared at it for a long moment, shoulders sagging. The day hadn't even properly begun, and already the land was testing them. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Nora stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. "Pump's frozen," he said simply. Nora nodded, her expression determined. "Then we haul by hand. Where's your well bucket?" James found himself studying her face, searching for any sign of complaint or hesitation. He found none. "Out by the barn. But hauling water's heavy work." "I'm stronger than I look," Nora replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Show me what needs doing." The well stood a fair distance from the house, requiring them to lead the old mule, Chester, back and forth with barrels strapped to his sides. James demonstrated how to secure the harness, expecting to need to explain it several times. But Nora's fingers moved surely, checking each strap with careful attention. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting the final buckle. "Exactly right." James couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Where'd you learn about tack?" "Pomatov been worthless at most things, but he did teach us horsework before the drinking got bad." Nora's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "Come on, Chester," she said to the mule, who laid his ears back stubbornly. None of that now. To James's amazement, Chester responded to her firm but gentle handling better than he ever had for James himself. The usually obstinate mule followed Nora's lead without his usual balking and sidesteps. "Well, I'll be," James muttered, watching them make their way to the well. That old mule's sweeter for her than honey on a biscuit. Inside the kitchen, Maybelle was already at work, despite the lack of running water. She had somehow managed to create the smell of fresh bread using the last of yesterday's water and what looked like odds and ends from the pantry. "Hope you don't mind," she said, glancing up as James entered. "I found some dried apples in the back of the cupboard. Thought they might make a nice addition to breakfast." The kitchen slowly filled with warmth from the stove and the scent of baking bread. Maybelle hummed as she worked, her movements efficient despite her size. She had a way of making the most of every scrap, turning yesterday's beans into a hearty soup, stretching flour with careful measuring, finding uses for even the smallest leftovers. "Land sakes," she chuckled, pulling out a slightly scorched loaf. "This bread's like me, a bit rough around the edges, but solid inside." Her self-deprecating humor drew reluctant smiles from both James and Nora. It was becoming a pattern. Maybelle's gentle wit-lifting spirits just when the day's hardships threatened to overwhelm them. Evening found them gathered around the lamp, as had become their custom. Maybelle started singing first, her voice clear and sweet on an old hymn. Nora joined in after a moment, and their harmonies filled the cabin's corners with warmth. James didn't sing, but he closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. How long had it been since these walls had heard anything besides silence? Since his brother's death, the cabin had been as quiet as a tomb. Now it felt alive again, awakening to the sound of women's voices raised in song. The peaceful moment shattered. The next morning, when James found the letter, it had been slipped under his door sometime in the night. Expensive paper folded precisely, written in flowing script. A railroad agent named Harrison wanted to discuss purchasing his grazing rights. The offer looked generous at first glance, but James knew better. Good grazing land was worth its weight in gold out here. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. This had Silas Dyer's fingerprints all over it. James could almost hear the man's wheedling voice, pointing out James's spread to the railroad men. Suggesting pressure points, James crumpled the paper in his fist, the fine material turning to waste in his grip. Without a word, he threw it into the morning's fire, watching the flames curl around the edges until it was nothing but ash. "Something wrong?" Maybelle asked from the stove, where she was stirring a pot of porridge. "Nothing to trouble yourself about," James replied, but his jaw was tight as he pulled on his coat. "I need to ride into town, check on some business. You two all right handling things here for the morning?" Nora looked up from where she was mending a torn shirt. We'll manage. Chester and I have an understanding now about the water hauling. She paused, studying his face. This business, it's about PA, isn't it? James hesitated, then nodded slowly. Might be. Best I find out for certain. Be careful, Maybelle said softly. Paws like a rattler, most dangerous when you think you've got him cornered. James mounted up and rode out, the sisters watching from the doorway. Once he was out of sight, Maybelle turned to Nora, her usual cheerful expression replaced by worry. He won't quit, you know, she said, wringing her apron between her hands. Pa, I mean. He's got his mind set on something, and he won't let go until he gets it or destroys it trying. Nora reached out and caught her sister's restless hands, stilling them. I know, but we're not alone this time, May James? He's different from the others. Pa's tried to manipulate. That's what worries me, Maybelle whispered. Pa will see that too, and he won't like it one bit. The sisters stood together in the doorway a moment longer, watching the empty road where James had disappeared. Then, without speaking, they turned back to their tasks. The animals needed feeding, water needed hauling. And the day's work wouldn't wait, no matter what schemes their father might be plotting in town. The winter wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters like skeleton fingers tapping on glass. Inside, Maybelle and Nora worked steadily, trying not to watch the sun's slow crawl across the sky, trying not to wonder what news James would bring when he returned. James rode back to the ranch as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground. His mare's hooves crunched through patches of ice, each step echoing his troubled thoughts. The news from town sat heavy in his chest. Like a stone, he couldn't shift. The sisters were waiting on the porch when he returned, their breaths visible in the cold air. One look at his face told them all they needed to know. Come inside, Maybelle said softly. I've got cornbread warming by the fire. In the kitchen. James hung his coat and hat, then sank into a chair at the worn table. Nora poured coffee while Maybelle cut thick slices of golden cornbread. For a moment, only the tick of the clock and the crackle of the stove broke the silence. Tell us, Nora finally said. Her voice steady, James wrapped his hands around the steaming cup. Your pa's been busy. Met with railroad men 3 days ago at the Silver Dollar. Been showing them papers, talking about land rights. He took a deep breath. Seems he's convinced them he's got some claim to my grazing land through old boundary disputes. But that's not true. Nora's fist hit the table, making the cups rattle. Truth ain't always what matters with railroad companies, James said wearily. They're looking to lay track through the valley. If they can't buy the rights fair, they'll find other ways. Your pa's giving them just the excuse they need. Maybelle had been quiet, her hands folded in her lap. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. The Lord will make a way. James glanced at her, surprised by the certainty in her tone. He brought us here, didn't he? Maybelle continued. When we had nowhere else to go, he'll see us through this, too. Faith's all well and good. Nora cut in, practical as always, but we need to do something ourselves. We can't just sit here waiting for PA to destroy everything. She straightened in her chair, chin lifting. No one can say we're burdens if we keep this ranch running better than ever. James studied both sisters, seeing the determination in their faces. What do you have in mind? I noticed your tack room's full of broken harness, Nora said. I can fix that. Good leather work brings fair prices in town, and I can bake, Maybelle added. Not just cornbread, but proper bread. Pies, too. Fresh baking always sells, especially in winter. Over the next days, their words proved true. Nora spent hours in the tack room, her strong fingers working oil into dried leather, replacing stitching and mending breaks. The pile of usable harness and bridles grew steadily. Her work was neat and strong, better than the original in many cases. Maybelle turned the kitchen into her domain. The smell of fresh bread filled the house daily. She worked magic with simple ingredients, turning flour and water into crusty loaves that James traded in town for necessities. Her first batch brought enough lamp oil to last a month. The second earned them nails for fence repair. James found himself watching them with growing respect. Where he had expected complaints about the hard work, he found determination. Where he had feared helplessness, he discovered capability. The ranch began to change. Small improvements appeared: a mended gate here, fresh curtains there, patches on the barn roof. Even Chester the mule seemed to stand straighter under his newly repaired harness. One evening, James came in from checking the cattle to find Maybelle teaching Nora to knit by lamplight. Their quiet laughter and the click of needles filled the room with a comfort he'd almost forgotten could exist. "Found an old sweater in that trunk upstairs," Maybelle explained. "To worn to wear, but good wool. Thought we might make new mittens before the deep cold sets in." James nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. How long had it been since anyone had thought about such things in his home? Since anyone had cared enough to plan ahead to make things comfortable? Still, Silas's shadow lay across everything like a frost. James caught himself watching the road, tensing at unexpected sounds. The sisters never spoke of their father, but he saw how they too kept wary eyes on the horizon. Sunday came, crisp and clear. The little church at the edge of town was warm with lamp oil and body heat. James sat between the sisters and their usual pew, aware of the whispers that still followed them, but caring less each week. The preacher spoke of Daniel in the lion's den, of faith in dark places. James found himself listening with new attention. When heads bowed for prayer, something shifted in his heart. For the first time in years, since before his brother's death had frozen his faith, James heard his own voice join the others. The words came rough and uncertain at first, like water breaking through ice. "Lord," he whispered, "help us stand firm. Show us the way through." He felt Maybelle's hand slip into his, warm and comforting. On his other side, Nora's shoulder pressed against his in silent support. In that moment, their strength flowed into him, just as his had once sheltered them. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of beef stew and Maybelle's fresh bread, James looked at the sisters, really looked at them. Nora sharp-witted and capable, her hands strong from working leather. Maybelle gentle-hearted but steel-spined, her faith as steady as the bread she baked daily. They were not burdens. They never had been. They were the very thing his empty ranch had needed: life and purpose and hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words inadequate, but sincere. "For what?" Nora asked, passing him the breadbasket. "For showing me the ranch can live again. For reminding me there's always hope." Maybelle smiled, her eyes bright. "That's what family does. Family." The words settled in James's chest like a warm coal, thawing something long frozen. Whatever Silas had planned, whatever the railroad might try, they would face it together. God had brought these sisters to his door for a reason. Maybe it wasn't just about him helping them. Maybe they were meant to help him too. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows on the wall. 3 figures around a table, no longer alone, no longer lost. Outside, the wind might howl and Silas might scheme. But in here, hope had taken root and was growing stronger every day. The February sun brought hints of warmth to the Colorado highlands, melting patches of snow and revealing tufts of brown grass beneath. James Boone stood on his porch at dawn, studying the sky with a weathered eye. The cattle needed moving to the south pasture before the next storm rolled in. Inside the kitchen, Maybelle stirred a pot of porridge while Nora pulled on her brother's old boots, claimed from the trunk upstairs. When James entered, stamping his feet for warmth, Nora looked up with determination. "I'm coming with you today," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll need help with the herd." James paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Fo'castle talk, seeing you ride astride. Let them." Nora's chin lifted. "Unless you'd rather do it alone and lose half the herd in that ravine." A ghost of a smile crossed James's face. She had a point. The South Trail was tricky, with narrow passages where cattle could easily scatter. 2 riders would make the work safer and faster. Maybelle set bowls of steaming porridge on the table. "I'll keep the home fires burning. Have biscuits and stew waiting when you return." Her gentle voice carried quiet strength. "The Lord knows our needs better than town gossips." They ate quickly, the kitchen warm with lamplight and coffee steam. Outside, the horses nickered in the pre-dawn chill. James helped Nora saddle her mount, a steady bay mare who seemed unbothered by her rider's size. If the horse didn't mind, James reckoned, neither should anyone else. The sun crested the eastern ridge as they set out, frost crackling under hoofs. The cattle, winter lean but healthy, moved easily once they caught the scent of fresh grass. James and Nora flanked the herd. Keeping them to the trail, Nora proved a natural on horseback, anticipating where cattle might break away and heading them off before they could scatter. Her quick mind and steady seat impressed James more with each passing hour. By midday, they'd made good time, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and share the bread and cheese. Maybelle had packed. "You handle yourself well out here," James said. Watching Nora check her mare's girth before remounting, "Pa never let us near the horses." Nora's voice held old hurt. "Said we'd break their backs. But I used to watch the cowboys, learning what I could from a distance." She swung into the saddle with practiced ease. "Reckon I showed him wrong." The afternoon brought them to the south pasture, grass showing green in protected hollows. Getting the cattle through the narrow ravine proved tricky, but with 2 riders working in sync, they managed without losing a single stray. James found himself remembering other cattle drives, working these same trails with his brother before the fever took him. They reached home as dusk painted the sky purple. Maybelle met them at the gate, her face glowing in the lamplight streaming from the kitchen windows. The smell of fresh bread and beef stew drew them inside like a beacon. Over supper, James surprised himself by speaking of the past. "Haven't worked cattle that smooth since Thomas died," he admitted, breaking a warm biscuit. "He and I knew each other's moves without speaking, just like today." Nora ducked her head, pleased. Maybelle reached across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. "The Lord brings healing in unexpected ways," Maybelle said softly. Laughter came easier that evening, warming the kitchen like the lamp's glow. They shared stories over coffee and Maybelle's apple cake, James telling tales of cattle drives past, Nora describing the mare's clever way with strays, Maybelle adding her own observations of the ranch's subtle changes. The night felt rich with possibility, but peace, like winter sunshine, proved fleeting. Morning brought the thunder of hooves in the yard. James looked up from mending tack to see Silas Dyer approaching, swaying drunk in his saddle. 2 men in city clothes, railroad men by their look, flanked him on sleek horses. Nora emerged from the barn, pitchfork in hand. Maybelle appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping flour from her fingers. James set down his work and stood, careful to keep his movements slow and steady. "Well, if it ain't the happy family." Silas's voice carried the slur of whiskey. He half fell dismounting, catching himself on his horse's shoulder. "Got some papers here might interest you, Boone." The railroad men exchanged uneasy glances as Silas fumbled in his coat. He produced a stack of wrinkled documents, waving them like a flag. "Sold my rights," he crowed, "both to the land and them useless girls. Railroad's gonna run track right through your precious grazing ground." He sneered at his daughters. "And these 2? legally bound to work off my debts, however the company sees fit. You're a liar. Nora's voice cracked like a whip. She stepped forward, fingers white-knuckled on the pitchfork handle. You've got no rights to sell. Silas's face twisted. He lunged forward with surprising speed, his open hand catching Nora across the face. The sound echoed in the yard like a gunshot. James moved without thinking. Placing himself between Silas and Nora, his hand fell to the revolver at his hip, not drawing, but ready. Prayer rose in his throat, even as his fingers brushed cold steel. Lord, don't let this come to shooting. That's enough, he said. Voice quiet but carrying iron. These women are under my protection now. Whatever papers you've got there ain't worth the ink wasted on them. The railroad men shifted in their saddles. Clearly uncomfortable with how events were unfolding, the older one, gray-bearded and wearing an expensive coat, cleared his throat. Mr. Dyer, he said carefully, you assured us these property transfers were legitimate. If there's any question, ain't no question. Silas spat in the snow at James's feet. I got witnesses. Signatures. Judge's seal and everything. We'll see what the real judge has to say, James replied evenly. Now get off my land. The railroad men exchanged another look. The younger one touched his hat brim. Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time, Mr. Dyer. When everyone's had a chance to review the documentation properly, Silas whirled on them, nearly losing his balance. Cowards. You promised me, we promise nothing without proof of clear title. The older man cut in sharply. Good day to you all. He reined his horse around, his companion following suit. Silas watched them ride away, his face mottling with rage. He turned back to James, swaying. This ain't over, Boone. You hear me? I'll see you ruined for stealing my property. Your property. Nora's voice shook with fury. She touched her reddened cheek. We were never property, PA. We're people. Human beings. And we're done being your pawns. Mabel's quiet voice carried from the porch. Please leave, Pa. Before you do something else you'll regret. Silas's hand twitched toward his gun. But James's steady gaze stopped him. For a moment they stood frozen, James protecting the sisters, Silas wavering between rage and fear. Finally, the older man stumbled back to his horse, mounting awkwardly. Ain't over, he repeated, but his voice held more desperation than threat. He wheeled his horse around, kicking it harder than necessary, and galloped away. The yard fell silent except for the wind. James felt Nora trembling behind him, though whether from anger or delayed shock, he couldn't tell. Mabel hurried down from the porch to embrace her sister. Come inside, she said softly. Let me look at that cheek. James watched them go, his hand finally leaving his gun. The morning sun caught the papers Silas had dropped, tumbling them across the snow like dead leaves. He gathered them up, noting the clumsy attempt at forgery. The railroad men had seen it too, he reckoned. They wouldn't be back, but Silas would. That much was certain. The question was, what would he try next? James looked at the kitchen window, where lamplight glowed warm against the morning gray. Inside, he could hear Mabel's gentle voice mixing with Nora's stronger one. Whatever came, they would face it together. The Lord had brought them this far. He would see them through. Tucking the fraudulent papers into his coat, James headed inside to check on his family. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barn's weathered boards as James inspected the damage from Silas's visit. His fingers traced splintered wood where the drunk man's horse had kicked through a stall partition. The familiar scents of hay and leather mingled with the acrid tang of smoke from where Silas had carelessly dropped his cigarette, nearly starting a fire. Thank the Lord they'd caught it in time. Outside, the sisters' voices drifted through the cool air. Nora led the workhorse to water while Maybelle scattered feed for the chickens. They'd taken to ranch life with surprising determination, never complaining about the endless chores. James watched through the barn door as Nora patted the horse's neck, speaking soft words of encouragement. The sight stirred something in his heart, a warmth he hadn't felt since losing his brother. "Mr. Boone." Maybelle appeared in the doorway, her round face flushed from exertion. "Supper's nearly ready. I made cornbread with the last of the meal." James nodded, driving one final nail into the repaired partition. "Much obliged, Miss Maybelle. I'll wash up directly." The kitchen glowed with lamplight as they gathered around the worn table. Steam rose from bowls of beans and fresh bread, simple, fair-made special by Maybelle's careful touch. After grace, they ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and murmur of appreciation. As James sopped the last of his beans with a piece of cornbread, Nora cleared her throat. "Mr. Boone, James, we'd like to share something with you. A hymn our mother taught us before she passed." Maybelle's eyes brightened. "Oh yes, please let us." It always brought such comfort in hard times. James hesitated, then nodded. It had been years since music filled these walls. The sisters exchanged glances, then Maybelle's clear soprano rose soft and sweet. "Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Nora's deeper alto joined in, weaving harmony beneath her sister's melody. The familiar words took on new beauty in their voices, filling the cabin with something holy. James found himself transported to childhood memories of his own mother singing by candlelight. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The hymn swelled and faded like a prayer. In its wake, James bowed his head, overwhelmed by a peace he'd thought forever lost. Here in this humble kitchen, with these two souls who'd suffered so much yet kept their faith, he felt God's presence more clearly than he had since Thomas died. "That was mighty fine," he managed finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother taught you well." Maybelle wiped tears from her cheeks. "She always said music could heal broken hearts, if we let it." "Reckon she was right about that," James said softly. They spent another hour by lamplight, the sisters teaching James the harmonies to hymns he half remembered. Their voices grew more confident with each verse, and even James found himself humming along. For one precious evening, trouble seemed far away, but peace, like morning mist, proved fragile. Dawn broke steel-gray over the highlands, bringing with it the thunder of approaching hooves. James stepped onto the porch, coffee cup in hand, to see Tom Wheeler's bay mare galloping up the trail. The neighboring rancher pulled up hard in the yard, his face grave. "James," he called, not bothering to dismount. "Thought you ought to know, Silas. Dier's been running his mouth down at Hartley's saloon all night." James set his cup on the porch rail, jaw tightening. "What's he saying now?" "Nothing good. Swearing he'll take them girls back, by force if need be." Wheeler shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Said something about burning you out if you try to stop him." "He's drunk and desperate, James. Dangerous combination." Behind James, the screen door creaked. Maybelle stood there, face pale, flour still dusting her apron. Nora appeared beside her, eyes hard with anger. "He can't take us," Nora said firmly. "We're not his property." "No," James agreed. "You're not. And you're not going anywhere." Wheeler nodded soberly. "Just watch your back, friend. Man like that, cornered and drinking, liable to do most anything." He touched his hat brim. "Ladies, James, with that." He wheeled his mare around and rode out. James gripped the porch railing, staring at the distant mountains. The wood felt solid under his fingers, grounding him as his thoughts raced. He'd seen men like Silas before, proud men broken by their own choices, striking out like wounded animals at anyone near. "Please, Maybelle's voice quavered. "Please don't meet him with violence." "There's been enough of that already, Mr. Boone," Nora added. "We're not worth getting killed over." James turned to face them. These two women who'd somehow become family in the space of a few weeks. Maybelle's gentle faith, Nora's fierce courage, they deserved so much better than living in fear. "You're worth protecting," he said quietly. "I promised you safety under my roof, and I mean to keep that promise." "But not with a gun," Maybelle pleaded. "Not with more hatred. There must be another way." James ran a hand through his hair, fear gnawing at his gut despite his brave words. Silas was unpredictable, capable of anything in his current state. One wrong move could end in tragedy. "I'll do what I have to," he said finally. "But I give you my word, I won't seek violence. We'll find a way through this that honors the Lord's teachings." Maybelle nodded, relieved. Nora looked less convinced, but she squeezed her sister's hand in solidarity. "Best get to our chores," James continued, forcing lightness into his tone. "Those cows won't milk themselves." They settled into the morning routine, but tension hung in the air like storm clouds. James found himself checking the horizon frequently as he worked, starting at unexpected sounds. The peace of the previous evening felt like a distant dream in the kitchen. He could hear the sisters washing breakfast dishes, their voices raised in another hymn. The melody drifted out to where he split wood, carrying words of trust and deliverance. James paused, axe in hand, letting the music wash over him. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come." The familiar verse steadied his heart. Whatever Silas planned, they would face it together, with faith instead of fear. James breathed deep of the morning air, tasting snow on the wind. Winter wasn't done with them yet, but spring would come. It always did. Squaring his shoulders, he returned to his work. The wood split clean and true under his axe, each stroke a quiet prayer for strength and wisdom in the days ahead. James walked the perimeter of his ranch house one final time that evening, checking latches and testing door hinges. The winter wind whistled through gaps in the weathered wood, carrying an edge that made him pull his coat tighter. Inside the barn, he adjusted 3 lanterns, positioning them where their light would reveal any intruder's approach. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, sensing his unease. He patted Old Buck's neck, murmuring soft words to settle the gelding. The cattle bedded down for the night, lowed quietly in the darkness beyond the barn doors. Everything seemed secure, but anxiety gnawed at his gut back in the house. He found Maybelle at the kitchen table, Bible open before her. Nora sat nearby, mending a torn shirt by lamplight. The sisters looked up as he entered, their faces reflecting his own concern. "All locked up tight?" Nora asked, setting aside her needlework. James nodded. "Reckon we've done what we can. Best try to get some rest." "I'll keep praying," Maybelle said softly, her fingers tracing the worn pages of scripture. They retired to their rooms, but sleep proved elusive. James lay fully clothed atop his bed, boots still on, listening to the night sounds. The clock in the main room struck 11, then midnight. He had almost drifted off when a new scent cut through his drowsiness. Smoke, his eyes snapped open. The acrid smell grew stronger, and an orange glow flickered through his window. The barn was burning. Fire. He shouted, already running for the door. "Get up. The barn's on fire." He burst into the yard, heart pounding at the sight of flames leaping from the barn's roof. The dry winter wood caught eagerly, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Inside, he could hear the terrified cries of trapped animals. James sprinted to the well, his mind racing. The water barrel by the kitchen, they'd need bucket lines, wet blankets, anything to fight the inferno. He heard the sisters scrambling out of the house behind him. "Stay back," he yelled, but Nora was already running to help, her nightdress covered by a hastily donned coat. Together they worked the pump handle, filling buckets as fast as they could. The horses? Nora cried, "We have to get them out." James knew she was right. The flames hadn't yet reached the stalls, but smoke poured through the gaps in the roof. He raced for the barn doors, Nora close behind, despite his protests. Heat slapped their faces as they entered. The horses kicked and screamed in terror. James fought to control Old Buck while Nora worked to free the other animals. Smoke burned their eyes and throats as they struggled with panic-stricken beasts. Finally, the horses bolted for safety, nearly trampling them in their flight. "Get out," James ordered, coughing. "The roof's going." But Nora had already turned toward the cattle pen. "We can't leave them." A terrible cracking sound split the air. James looked up to see a burning beam tilt, then plummet toward where Nora stood. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm and yanking her backward with all his strength. They tumbled together onto the dirt floor as the massive timber crashed down exactly where she had been standing. "Move." James dragged her to her feet, pushing her toward the door. They stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping and choking. Maybelle ran to them, her face streaked with tears. The barn was fully engulfed now. Nothing could save it. They could only watch as the flames devoured years of hard work, taking with it the trapped cattle, winter feed, and tools they desperately needed. The heat drove them back as sections of the roof collapsed inward with thunderous crashes. James organized the bucket line anyway, hoping to at least keep the fire from spreading to the house or nearby trees. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the glow in the sky, but it was too late for anything but containment. They worked through the night, passing buckets and beating out wind-blown embers. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the smoking ruins. The barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton, still smoldering in places. Dead cattle lay where they had fallen, and the acrid stench of burnt flesh hung in the air. The surviving horses huddled in the far pasture, steam rising from their sweaty flanks. James sat heavily on an overturned bucket, his face and clothes streaked with soot. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their loss. Without the barn, without winter feed and shelter for the livestock, how could they possibly survive until spring? Maybelle approached quietly, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We'll rebuild," she whispered. "The Lord will make a way." "How?" James's voice cracked. "Everything we need, everything I've worked for years to build, it's gone." "And for what?" "Because your father's pride matters more than human decency." "Then we'll start over," Nora declared, her face set with determination despite the burns and bruises she'd sustained. "We're not leaving you to face this alone." Neighbors stood in small groups, shaking their heads and muttering. James could hear their doubts clearly enough. Taking in the Dyer sisters had brought this trouble on him, they'd say. Any sensible man would send them away now, cut his losses before worse befell him. But looking at Maybelle's quiet strength and Nora's fierce loyalty, James knew he couldn't do it. These women had become more than just responsibilities. They were family. The thought of sending them back to Silas's cruelty made his stomach turn. Tom Wheeler approached, hat in hand. "James, I'm powerful, sorry about this. Reckon we all know who's behind it, though proving it's another matter." Silas was seen leaving town late last night, another neighbor added, riding hard toward the hills. James nodded slowly. The proof didn't matter now, the damage was done. Silas's hatred had cost them dearly, nearly at the price of his own daughter's life. The thought of how close Nora had come to death under that falling beam made his hands clench into fists. "What will you do?" Wheeler asked quietly. Before James could answer, Maybelle spoke up. "We'll do what God's people have always done in times of trial. We'll pray, we'll work, and we'll help each other rebuild." "That's right," Nora added, standing straighter, despite her obvious exhaustion. "This is our home now, too, if Mr. Boone will have us. We won't be driven away by fear and spite." James looked at the sisters, then at the concerned faces of his neighbors. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows from the barn's skeletal remains. The morning was bitterly cold, but something warm stirred in his chest, something like hope. "Wheeler," he said finally, "might we impose on your barn for a spell? At least for the surviving stock. Course you can. Martha's already fixing up the back room for the ladies too, if they need it." "Much obliged," James nodded. "But I reckon we'll stay here. Time to show Silas Dyer that burning down a barn won't break us." He stood, muscles protesting after the long night's battle. Around them, neighbors were already starting to clear debris, discussing lumber and nails, making plans. Their quiet support wrapped around James like a warm blanket, reminding him that even in the darkest times, light could still be found. James stared at the blackened ruins of his barn, his throat tight. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scorched timbers and ash-covered ground. Everything he'd worked for lay in ruins. His cattle, what remained of them, had been moved to Wheeler's place. But that was a temporary solution at best. Two railroad men stood beside their horses, shifting uncomfortably. The taller one, Morton, cleared his throat. "Way we see it, Mr. Boone. This land's gotten too ... complicated. Railroad can't invest where there's this much trouble." James nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. The railroad money would have helped rebuild, maybe even set them ahead. Now that hope was gone too. "We'll be moving on," the second man added, already turning toward his horse. "Might be best if you did the same." They mounted up and rode away, leaving James alone with the bitter taste of defeat. He'd fought so hard to hold on to this land, and now everything was slipping through his fingers like water. Inside the cabin, Maybelle had managed to put together a simple supper from their dwindling supplies. The table looked bare, just beans, a few biscuits, and some dried apple slices. James sat heavily in his chair, remembering better days when the pantry had been full. Nora broke the heavy silence. "I've been thinking," she said, pushing her plate aside. Folk in town always praised Maybelle's bread, even when they were being mean about everything else. And I'm fair hand with a needle, learned from necessity. Mending Pa's clothes all those years, Maybelle's eyes brightened slightly. "We could sell bread and do mending work. Might not be much, but it'd help." And Maybelle hesitated, then continued softly. "I've always dreamed of teaching little ones. The schoolhouse is desperate for help since Miss Jenkins married and moved away." James tried to smile, though his heart ached. These women, who'd lost everything themselves, were still fighting to find a way forward. Meanwhile, he sat wallowing in despair. "That's good thinking," he managed. "Both of you." But later that night, alone in his room, the weight of their situation crushed down on him. The ranch had barely sustained him before. How could it support 3 people now? Winter wasn't done with them yet, and without proper shelter for the livestock or stored feed, their losses would only grow. Dawn came too soon. James hitched the wagon and began the grim task of clearing away the barn's remains. Each charred beam he loaded felt like lifting a piece of his broken dreams. The sisters worked alongside him, salvaging what they could: bent nails, scorched tools. Anything that might still serve. Neighbors passed on the road throughout the day. Some called out words of sympathy, others just shook their heads. A few slowed their wagons to look, but none stopped to help. James understood everyone had their own troubles, their own work to do. Still, the loneliness of their struggle weighed heavy. "Shame about them, sisters," he overheard one man say to another as they rode past. "Brought nothing but trouble to poor Boone's place." James gripped his hammer tighter, wanting to shout back that they were wrong. Maybelle and Nora hadn't brought this trouble, their father's cruelty had. The sisters had brought life back to his empty home. It's given him a reason to keep going when he'd nearly lost hope. The sun was setting when they finally stopped work for the day. James's muscles ached and his hands were raw from hauling timber. Inside, Maybelle had somehow managed to make their meager supper smell inviting, though they all knew their stores were running dangerously low. After the dishes were cleared, James retreated to his room. For the first time in years since losing his brother, he felt the overwhelming need to pray. Not the automatic prayers of his childhood, but something deeper, more desperate. He knelt beside his bed, clasping his calloused hands together. Words didn't come easily at first. How long had it been since he'd really talked to God? "Lord," he whispered finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know if I deserve to ask anything of you. Been a long time since I looked to you for help. But these sisters, .. double quotes," he paused, swallowing hard. "They need your strength more than I do. They've suffered enough, been cast aside by their own flesh and blood. Please, Lord, help me find a way to protect them, to provide for them." Tears he hadn't expected burned his eyes. "I know I ain't much. Just a failing rancher with more problems than prospects. But Maybelle and Nora, they've become family to me. More family than I thought I'd ever have again after Thomas died. Don't let my shortcomings be their undoing." The quiet of the night settled around him as he prayed. From the other room, he could hear the sisters' soft voices as they prepared for bed. Maybelle was humming an old hymn, one his mother used to sing. The familiar melody wrapped around his heart like a gentle hand. "Give me wisdom," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Show me the path forward. Not for my sake, Lord, but for theirs. They deserve so much more than what life's handed them." When he finally rose from his knees, his legs were stiff from kneeling so long. The moon had risen, casting silver light through his window. James stood there for a moment, looking out at his land, the burned barn, the empty corrals, the frost-covered fields. For the first time since the fire, he felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope yet, but maybe it was the beginning of it. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but they would face them together. Somehow they would find a way forward. He thought of Nora's determination to contribute, of Maybelle's dream of teaching. They hadn't given up, despite everything. Maybe that was God's first answer to his prayers, the reminder that strength often came wrapped in unexpected packages. Through his window, he could see the stars scattered across the dark sky, bright and steady. The same stars his brother Thomas had loved to watch, the same stars that had guided countless travelers home. Perhaps they would guide him too. Show him the way through this valley of shadows. James turned away from the window and prepared for bed, his prayer still echoing in his heart. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight, he had done something he'd thought he'd never do again. He had reached out to God. Not for himself, but for the family he never expected to find. 2 days after James's prayer, the morning sun cast long shadows across the scorched remains of the barn. James stood at the water pump, working the handle with weary determination, when hoofbeats approached from the east. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt, but he relaxed at the sight of the familiar rider. Henry Lone Horse sat tall in his saddle, his dark eyes taking in the blackened timbers and empty corrals. The Apache ranch hand had worked cattle with James's brother Thomas years ago, before the fever took him. Henry dismounted with fluid grace, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Bad business here," Henry said quietly, leading his horse toward the house. "Word travels fast about Silas Dyer's doing." James nodded, picking up his water bucket. "Reckon you heard right. Lost most of my winter feed storage, some good cattle too." Inside the cabin, Maybelle was kneading bread dough while Nora mended a torn quilt. Both women looked up as James and Henry entered, their faces showing surprise but not fear. They had heard stories of Henry's friendship with Thomas, though neither had met him before. "Ladies," Henry said, removing his hat respectfully, "I hope you don't mind my coming by." Maybelle wiped her hands on her apron. "Any friend of James is welcome here. Would you take coffee with us?" James stoked the fire while Maybelle poured coffee into tin cups. Henry settled onto a rough-hewn chair, his eyes thoughtful as steam rose from his cup. The morning light filtering through the window caught the silver at his temples. Testament to decades of reading the land and its ways. "I came because I heard about Silas's claims," Henry said finally. "About the papers he's waving around town, saying he's sold both the land rights and his daughter's guardianship." Nora's hands stilled on her mending. "That man hasn't been our father in truth for years, no matter what papers he's forged." Henry nodded slowly. "Those papers, they're not worth the ink used to write them." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, careful not to spill his coffee. "I've been studying the old treaties, the water rights agreements. Been teaching myself to read them proper, to protect what's mine and help others protect what's theirs." James leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "What are you saying, Henry?" "Your land, James. It's protected under the Miller Creek Water Rights Agreement of 1873. Silas can't sell what he don't own, and he surely don't own your water access. Without water rights, any land deed he's trying to sell is worthless." Hope flickered in James's chest, but caution tempered it. "The railroad men might not care about old treaties, but the Territorial Council will," Henry said firmly. "They have to. Too many ranchers depend on those water rights being honored. If one false claim stands, more will follow." Maybelle's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You'd help us. Testify about the treaties." Henry turned to her, his expression gentle. "Your brother Thomas saved my life once, James. Rode through a blizzard to bring medicine when my youngest was dying of fever. I never forgot that debt." He paused, setting his cup down. "But this isn't just about old debts. It's about what's right. Silas Dyer's cruelty needs to stop." Nora stood suddenly, her quilt falling to the floor. "James, this is an answer to prayer." Henry's knowledge, the treaty's gods provided a way. James rubbed his jaw, considering. He knew how deep prejudice ran in town. Some folks would dismiss Henry's testimony simply because of his Apache blood. No matter how sound his knowledge of the laws might be, as if reading his thoughts, Henry spoke again. "I know what you're thinking, James, but times are changing. Slow as molasses may be, but changing all the same. The council's got to listen to the law, even if they don't much like who's speaking it." Maybelle moved from her place by the stove, crossing to where Henry sat. With tears streaming freely now, she took his weathered hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "We've been praying for help, for some way to stop PA's schemes. The Lord must have sent you." Henry seemed touched by her gesture, though he covered it with a small cough. "Well now, I don't know about being sent by anyone special. Just doing what needs doing." James watched the scene before him, Maybelle's grateful tears, Nora's fierce hope, Henry's quiet dignity. Something shifted in his heart, like ice breaking up on a spring river. Maybe this was what faith looked like, not just praying for help, but recognizing it when it came, even in unexpected forms. "When should we go to the council?" James asked, his decision made. "Next session's in 3 days," Henry replied. "I'll bring the treaty documents, speak to what I know." "But James," he fixed his friend with a steady gaze, "you'll have to stand firm. Silas won't take this quietly." "We'll stand with you," Nora declared, her chin lifted in determination. "Pa can't hurt us anymore, not if we face him together." The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth seeming to wrap around them like a promise. Outside, a meadowlark called, its clear notes carrying through the morning air. James remembered how Thomas used to say that meadowlarks sang sweetest after storm clouds cleared. They talked a while longer, making plans for the council meeting. Henry explained more about the water rights, showing them the key passages in the treaties that would prove their case. As the morning wore on, the weight that had pressed down on James these past weeks began to lift. When Henry finally rose to leave, the sun had climbed high in the sky. Maybelle pressed a fresh loaf of bread into his hands, wrapped carefully in clean cloth. "For your family," she said softly. "A small thank you." "Nothing small about kindness," Henry replied, tucking the bread into his saddlebag. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, settling into the saddle like it was part of him. "3 days then, James. We'll set things right." They watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast Colorado sky. The wind had shifted, bringing warmer air from the south. James could smell spring in it, though winter still held the land in its grip. That evening, as they sat down to supper, the mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. Maybelle had made a celebration of sorts, using precious stored vegetables to make a stew that filled the cabin with savory aromas. Nora had even found a jar of preserved peaches she'd been saving for a special day. "It feels different now," Maybelle said, passing the biscuits. "Like we can breathe again." James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Silas would fight them tooth and nail, and some folks would side with him just because it was simpler than facing hard truths. But for the first time since the barn burning, James felt real hope. They slept peacefully that night, all 3 of them, their hearts lighter with the promise of justice to come. The moon rose full and bright over the Colorado highlands, its silver light touching the remains of the barn, the frost-covered fields, the sleeping house. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, hope had found them again, in his room. James thought of Henry's words about Thomas, about debts and doing what was right. His brother would have been proud to see this day, to know that friendship could bridge any divide when truth and justice were at stake. With that comforting thought, James drifted into the first restful sleep he'd had in weeks. The next morning dawned clear and cold. James hitched the horses to his wagon while Maybelle wrapped warm blankets around their legs for the ride. Nora sat straight-backed beside him, her chin held high despite her obvious nervousness. Henry rode alongside on his own mount, the precious treaty documents secured in his saddlebag. The streets of town grew quiet as they approached, whispers following their progress. Women on the boardwalk paused in their shopping, and men stopped their conversations to stare as Henry dismounted beside the council hall steps. Inside, the room was already half full. Silas Dyer lounged near the front, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips as he waved his stack of papers at passing council members. His smile faltered when he saw Henry enter with James and the sisters. Henry stepped forward first, his voice steady and clear as he laid out the water rights treaties. His finger traced each relevant passage, pointing out how Silas's documents conflicted with established law. James followed with carefully preserved receipts and 3 neighbors, written testimony about his character and stewardship of the land. Then Nora rose, her hands trembling but her voice strong. "My father tried to sell my sister and me to cover his gambling debts," she declared. The room fell so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. The council members huddled together, speaking in low voices. When they finally announced their decision, confirming James's guardianship and land rights, Silas exploded from his chair, cursing and reaching for James. 2 deputies grabbed his arms, dragging him toward the door as he shouted threats all the way out. The winter sun cast long shadows as James, Maybelle, and Nora returned to their ranch. The air rang with the steady rhythm of hammers and saws. Henry had brought 5 neighboring families to help rebuild the barn. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the yard as men raised new beams against the crisp blue sky. Maybelle worked her magic in the kitchen, the aroma of fresh bread and apple pies drifting out to the workers. Her cheeks flushed with pride as the men called out compliments between hammer strikes. Nora sat on the porch, needle flying as she stitched thick work gloves for hands rubbed raw by lumber and rope. Something had shifted. In town after the council meeting, the sideways glances had turned to neighborly nods. Women who once whispered now stopped to chat with the sisters, asking for Maybelle's bread recipe or admiring Nora's neat stitching. As evening approached, the new barn stood nearly complete. Folks gathered inside the house for a proper barn-raising supper. Someone brought out a fiddle, and soon the cabin filled with music and laughter. The preacher offered thanks for good neighbors and new beginnings. James sat at the head of his table, watching it all. Maybelle served her golden bread while Nora poured coffee. The warmth of community wrapped around them like a quilt. His throat tightened as he looked at the sisters, no longer outcasts, but family. In the glow of the lamplight, he bowed his head, overcome with gratitude for this unexpected blessing. Spring softened the Colorado highlands as new rhythms settled over the Boone Ranch. Each morning, Nora straightened her shawl and walked the dusty road to the church school. A line of eager children following like ducklings. Her quick wit and kind heart made her a natural teacher, helping young ones master their letters and sums. Maybelle found her own calling, turning their kitchen window into a makeshift bakery. The aroma of fresh bread and apple pies drew folks from miles around. Her gentle smile and generous spirit turned customers into friends. James worked his cattle with renewed purpose, his shoulders straighter now. When word came that deputies had escorted Silas away from town for good, both sisters let out long-held breaths. That Sunday, Preacher Thompson's words rang clear through the little church. Mercy triumphs over judgment. James stood between Maybelle and Nora, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks as gratitude filled his heart. Spring thaw brought gentle warmth to the valley, softening the hard-packed earth and painting the hills with tender green. One evening, James, Maybelle, and Nora gathered around their worn kitchen table for a simple supper. Steam rose from bowls of hearty stew, while fresh-baked bread filled the air with its homey scent. A pitcher of cold milk stood between them. James paused, spoon halfway to his mouth, and looked around the lamplit kitchen. His heart swelled as understanding dawned. "I reckon the Lord's given me more than I ever asked for," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. Maybelle's smile brightened the room, while Nora reached across and squeezed his weathered hand. Through the window, their rebuilt barn stood proud against the sunset sky, the soft lowing of cattle carrying on the evening breeze as the fire crackled in the hearth. Their voices joined in familiar hymns, filling every corner of the home that had once known only loneliness and shame. Now these walls echoed with light, laughter, and the warmth of true belonging. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.